Now that we have spent some time thinking about the impact of the First World War on Germany, the November Revolution, as well as the Treaty of Versailles, I want to spend some time thinking about some of the echoing effects of the First World War and of Versailles and of the November Revolution on German society in the early 1920s. Now, the early 1920s for the Weimar Republic is probably one of the most formative in terms of its origins and in terms of its experience in consolidating power. But one of the things that's most important during this time period is the hyperinflation crisis of 1923. We will spend some time talking about its background causes, talking about the triggering events, and then thinking about what actually happens, what hyperinflation looked like, and then how it was ultimately resolved. So it should probably just go without saying, and really at the outset for GCSE history students, to just think about what hyperinflation actually is. Those of you who may be studying GCSE economics might have an understanding of what inflation is, where the value of currency decreases or the value of goods increases, depending on how you might measure it. And essentially, it means that the pound, let's say, has less value in time in the future than it does at current present state, and that's the idea of inflation. And generally speaking, an economy wants to keep inflation at a certain amount because deflation is where basically currency or the value of money increases over time. And that is actually, you might think that's actually a good thing, but if you think about what that would actually do, is that would incentivize everybody to just save all their money because it's just going to keep increasing in terms of value. And then the economy grinds to a halt when no one spends money on anything. So governments, like I said, try and keep inflation. I believe the Bank of England tries to keep inflation in this country at around 2%. Hyperinflation is where it just does not stop. It's where that essentially, because of decisions you make, and we'll talk about what those decisions are in a second, the value of your currency just drops and plummets and plummets and plummets to the point where you have to keep on increasingly printing more and more money to try and keep up with the inflation, which in turn makes inflation quicker. And then before you know it, you have basically got a currency that is valueless, that it costs billions and billions and billions of your currency to buy a loaf of bread, for example, to the point where it costs more to print the money than the money itself that you're printing. That's how much inflation can increase by. So this is what happens in Weimar Germany. This is what happens in 1923, and it has a substantial impact on society. As you can probably imagine, a society where a currency no longer works is not a very good one in sort of the modern era. So what causes this to happen? Well, the first point is that in 1914, Germany made the decision to suspend the gold standard and instead financed the First World War almost entirely through borrowing. They borrowed to try and pay for the First World War. Now, we've already spoken about why that is the case. They thought that this would be a quick victory. They thought that they would be able to smash through Belgium and destroy France very quickly and then turn around and go and destroy the Russian Empire. And before you know it, they are basically done and they can end the war before Christmas of 1914. And in doing so, they can also extract massive reparations from a very quick victory, and there would be no problem. So they basically took the risk of borrowing in order to try and expect the reward of getting these reparations payments through. Now, obviously, when this didn't happen, and when there was a stalemate in France, and when there was major fighting taking place in Russia, the currency began to be devalued, and the borrowing would continue to take place at a much greater rate. And so by the war's end, the Reichsbank was printing excessive amounts of money. When you print more money, it devalues the currency, because if you've got more of it, the value of each individual one is less and less and less. So, by printing money, you can sort of relieve temporarily economic crises, but you do risk slightly devaluing currencies. Okay. And so by the war's end, the devaluation of the mark, the Reichsmark, went from around 4.2 to up to 7.9 marks per US dollar. So a more stable currency like the US dollar could be compared to the Reichsmark. At one point, you would basically, for every $1, you would get 4.2 Reichsmarks. But because the value of the currency began to decrease, when you hand in $1 at the end of the war, you actually get 8 Reichsmarks back, signifying that there is less value for each of those Reichsmarks. There's actually half the value for each of those Reichsmarks. In addition, as we noted, 156 billion marks, around 106 billion marks, was the debt that the German government was saddled with, basically by the end of 1918. But this was only one part of the crisis. This was the first part of the crisis, essentially the fact that Germany ended the First World War on a pretty poor economic situation. But what continued and what made it worse was the reparations extracted by the Treaty of Versailles, the imposition of 132 billion gold marks in reparations, roughly £6.6 billion, in addition to the fact that, firstly, this was around 30 times more than what France had to pay to Germany when France was defeated by Germany in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. So a huge increase in reparations payments. But also, Germany lost a massive amount of resource-rich territories. Despite the fact that it was only around 10 to 13% of German territory, it represented around 75% of iron ore, it represented around 68% of zinc production, as well as around 26% of coal production. All of these resources were resources that could have been used to pay off the reparations, to pay off the debt, and to try and stabilize the economy. So the Versailles Treaty not only increased the amount of money that Germany would have to pay in terms of reparations, but also decreases the resources through which Germany would be able to make those payments in the first place. And so to cover the obligations imposed by Versailles, as well as the domestic needs of a government that is trying to run an economy, the government decided to continue printing more and more money. This sparks an increase in inflation. But this is only inflation. We've not quite got to hyperinflation yet, okay? Inflation happens in all different parts of the world and at all different times. 2022, for example, was a period of quite high inflation for the Western world, thanks to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so this is something that's not necessarily out of the ordinary. When we get to 1923, however, and 1922, there are some immediate causes that turns inflation into hyperinflation. The first of these is the default on reparations payments in November 1922. Essentially, Germany missed one of its reparations payments, and France and Belgium, seeking to get that money from Germany, and really quite bloodthirsty to get as much money as possible and exact as much out of Germany, decided, right, okay, well, you've missed your payment, we're going to invade. And so they began to invade Germany. They occupied the Ruhr. The Ruhr is Germany's industrial heartland. It's where a lot of coal production is taking place. And basically what their goal was to do was to essentially seize goods, seize industrial production as compensation, to pay for this reparations payment that was missed. Germany couldn't fight back. Germany had no military and did not have any kind of appetite for another war a few years after World War I. And so instead, it opted for a policy known as passive resistance. The Weimar government said basically to the Ruhr workers that you should go on strike, that you should not basically give into the wills and the wishes of the occupying powers. We do not support this occupation, so you should go on strike, and what we will do is we will pay your wages, and this would mean imprinting more money. So this is a double hit for the German economy, because on the one hand, you are having to pay workers who are on strike, which is obviously going to cost you more money, but on the other hand, you're not getting any benefit from it because you're paying them to not work. You're paying them to not do industrial production. Less output, flooding the money supply, we see inflation begin to spiral out of control. And this is really where we get the hyperinflation crisis that dominates 1923. In January 1923, for example, the currency is beginning to collapse already, okay? The cost of a loaf of bread in January 1923 was 250 marks. Now just imagine and try and make a comparison of if you went into a shop, you went into Tesco's tomorrow and you saw that a loaf of bread cost £250. You would be pretty shocked at that proposition, okay? Now, by November, that number had reached 200 billion marks. Okay, a single loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks, because the value of the goods and the value of the things that you are buying doesn't really change. It changes with supply and demand, and if there's more demand for a thing and all that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, it does not change in terms of its value. It's the value of the currency compared to those goods that is completely decreasing. So the value of that going from 250 marks to 200 billion marks is representative of just how little a single mark is worth by November 1923. We can see that by autumn 1923, the printing of banknotes, the actual printing of the money itself, was actually costing more than the money that you were printing. Okay, again, getting worse. In October, hyperinflation reached its peak. So for reference, by the way, hyperinflation, normal inflation in 2022, when we got the Russian invasion of Ukraine and hyperinflation peaked, or inflation peaked in Great Britain, I think it peaked around 9 to 12%. That was the sort of highest point of inflation during that time period. In October 1923 in Germany, inflation peaked to 29,500% per month. So basically 21% per day, cumulatively, continually, one day after the next. What does this mean? This means that essentially you go to bed one night and you wake up the next day and all the money you own is now worth 21% less than the day before. That's how much of an increase that was. And it's cumulative. So it's 21% per day, each and every day, which is why by the end of the month, it's almost exponential. It's the point where it's reaching nearly 30,000% inflation rates. This, of course, has major consequences, social consequences. There are pictures, in fact, of children carrying barrels of money around and are playing with it because it's valueless. It has no value at all. Increasingly, the Reichsbank had to keep on printing increasingly larger banknotes. So in the UK, we have a £50 banknote, we have a £20, we have a £10 banknote. In Weimar Germany in 1923, you would have like a 1 trillion mark banknote and things like that. Now, surprisingly, you would be thinking, well, how could anyone have won from inflation? There were winners, okay? So people who had debts and whose debts were fixed at a clear rate were able to pay them very, very quickly. Okay, so let's say you were in debt to the value of 100,000 marks at the start of 1923. Now, that might have been quite a substantial amount of debt that you were in, but by sort of April, May 1923, that 100,000 marks is worth nothing. So you could pay it off with a single banknote at that point. Very, very good for people who are in debt and who have mortgages that they can repay. They can just pay it off very, very quickly because the value of the currency that they're paying it with is now worthless. And so while it was worth something back then, it's now worth nothing. So those are the people who were able to basically found loan repayments negligible. Daily wage earners could also frequently negotiate pay. And you could also see that farmers benefited from the rising of prices because farmers, all of a sudden, the produce that they are creating is more valuable than the money that they would buy, that they would get for those produce. So the people who are actually making the things of value still manage to do quite well. The losers, however, included people who were salaried workers, people who were pensioners, whose pensions were now worthless. Someone who was on a fixed income at the start of 1923 would find that their income would not even be able to get them through the day in the end of 1923. Middle-class professionals who had life savings. If you had a savings account of 100,000 marks in 1923, you would find that maybe at the start of the year, that was quite a lot of money that you could buy things with. But by the end of the year, that's nothing. And you couldn't buy anything with it because the value of the currency just disappears. Okay. There are various different stories of authors. The author from Berlin, Maximilian Bern, lost around 100,000 marks in savings and allegedly died of hunger. Again, this is a sort of middle-class provision, and we can see that this is something that causes major problems for people like that. Society resorts to barter, so instead of using cash, they use trading of goods, like a traditional system before an economy came into reality. People would have wheelbarrows of cash, as I noted. They would use banknotes as wallpaper. Food riots began to take place. Crime and looting and law and order began to fray. The result is that there needed to be a political solution. There needed to be currency reform. And that's what we get. So in August 1923, just before it reaches its peak, the inflation crisis, we get Gustav Stresemann, who is a major political figure within the Weimar Republic. He takes office in July and issues an enabling act to essentially allow him to make major reforms by ruling by decree. He ends passive resistance in September 1923. So this eases some of the economic crisis. So you're no longer having to pay wages for workers who aren't doing anything. You're now actually being able to create industrial production. That helps. But what was needed was the introduction of a new currency. The currency you have is worthless, okay? You need to introduce a new currency. And that's what happens in November 1923. The Rentenmark replaces the worthless mark at a rate of 1 Rentenmark to 1 trillion Reichsmarks. And so basically, you're resetting the entire economy. The Reichsmarks is disappearing. You are now getting instead the Rentenmark, which is now back down to a normal rate of inflation. And backing this new currency by using mortgages on industrial and agricultural lands, we see that mortgage bonds begin to index to gold, and its stability begins to restore confidence in the market, which of course also begins to restore investment. A few complicated financial macroeconomic reasons why backing a currency against mortgages on industrial and agricultural land is a good thing. I'm not going to get into the reasons why that is the case. By November 1923, the mark pegged at around 4.2 Rentenmarks for each US dollar, which was a perfectly acceptable rate of inflation for an economy like Germany in 1923. Currency stabilization was then followed by the Dawes Plan of 1924 and the adoption of a new Reichsmark that was then backed by gold and then went back to the gold standard. The Dawes Plan also helped to establish a more realistic reparations payment scheme that was then supported by the Young Plan later on in 1928 and really saw currency stabilization and economic stabilization during this time period.